The Tuesday morning fog was still clinging to the harbor when Daniel Marsh settled into his usual chair at the window table of Anchor and Grain. He was 41, had a son who collected shark teeth, and had not been surprised by anything more startling than a misread tide chart in recent memory. He set his coffee down, opened his laptop, and watched a pelican land on the dock railing outside. That was when the three girls appeared. They were identical, same yellow rain slickers, same dark braids, same unhurried way of moving through a crowded room as though they owned the geometry of it. The one in front stopped 2 feet from his table and looked at his left forearm with the focused attention of a scientist examining a specimen. "Hello, sir," she said. "Our mom has a tattoo just like yours." Daniel looked down at his arm. The ink had been there for 17 years, seagrass and coral branch and nautilus shell, all rendered in deep teal and ocean green. He had drawn the design himself, on a paper napkin, in a dorm room that smelled like salt air and instant coffee. He had never seen anyone else wearing it. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Behind the girl, her 2 sisters watched him with matching expressions of calm curiosity. The cafe noise continued around them, the hiss of the espresso machine, the scrape of chairs, but at his table, something had gone very still. Daniel had lived in Harwick, Maine for 6 years, long enough that the barista knew his order and the harbor master waved at him from the dock. He had come for the research position at the Coastal Biology Institute. Stayed because his son Owen had made a best friend in the first week of kindergarten, and built a life here the way you build things when you're doing it alone, slowly, carefully, one solid piece at a time. His work involved monitoring eelgrass restoration along a 12-mile stretch of coastline, which suited him. The work was methodical, the results measurable, the setbacks interpretable. He spent 3 days a week in the field and 2 at his desk. Every Wednesday morning, he brought Owen to school early and came to Anchor and Grain for 90 minutes before his first meeting. It was the one ritual in his week that belonged entirely to him. Owen was 9 and had recently decided that marine biology was probably his future, a development Daniel treated with genuine encouragement and deliberate restraint. You let the interest breathe. You don't overwater it. Owen currently had 47 shark teeth in a jar on his windowsill, 3 books about cephalopods, and strong opinions about whether octopuses were smarter than dolphins. Daniel was a single father. His ex-wife lived in Portland, had Owen every other weekend, and the arrangement was civil and carefully maintained. He had been on 3 dates in the past 4 years. None had become a 4th date. He was not, he told himself, avoiding anything. He was simply busy in the way that single fathers with full-time research careers tend to be busy. There was always a tide log to review, a permission slip to sign, a school pickup to arrange. He was reviewing field notes when the girls appeared. He had never seen them before. In a town the size of Harwick, where you recognized most faces by the end of the first winter, 3 identical girls in yellow rain slickers were not something you forgot. "Our mom has a tattoo just like yours," the girl repeated, in case he had missed it the first time. "Can I ask your names?" Daniel said. "I'm Marin," she pointed left. "That's Calla." She pointed right. "That's June." They were perhaps 7 or 8, the kind of age where children speak to strangers with a directness that adults have mostly trained themselves out of. Marin had a small notebook tucked under her arm. June was holding a paper cup. Calla was watching him with an expression he could not quite read. He looked down at his left forearm. The tattoo covered the lower half, wrist to mid-forearm. Seagrass in long parallel strokes. A coral branch in the upper corner. The nautilus shell centered at the wrist, its spiral mathematically precise because he had drawn it with a compass. The whole thing in 2 colors, deep teal and a muted sage green that approximated the color of eelgrass in late summer. He had drawn it at 23, in the 2nd year of his master's program, on a Tuesday night. He had drawn it with 2 people in mind, though by the time he finally got it inked, he had been one person for several months. In 17 years, no one had ever said, "I have one like that." "Where's your mom?" he asked. Marin pointed toward the order counter. Daniel looked. A woman stood there with her back to him. Dark hair pulled into a low knot. A green canvas jacket. She was reading something on her phone. Her weight shifted to one hip in a way that was familiar, in a way he could not immediately locate the way a piece of music is familiar before you remember its name. Then she turned to look for her daughters, and Daniel understood, with sudden and complete clarity, why the tattoo had looked familiar to her children. 17 years was a long time. Long enough that the memories had taken on the quality of something preserved rather than lived. He could still recall the color of the light in the marine biology lab at Caldwell University, where he had first noticed her, but not the exact texture of the afternoon. Her name had been Nora Calloway. He had met her in September of their second year in the graduate program. She was studying coastal plant ecology. He was in marine habitat restoration, and they had been placed in the same seminar on applied conservation methods. She sat 3 seats to his left and asked the kind of questions that made the professor pause before answering. They became friends the way graduate students do, through shared exhaustion and proximity and the particular intensity of caring about the same obscure things. By the second semester, they were eating dinner together 3 nights a week and walking back to the graduate housing after. He fell in love with her slowly, and then, all at once, the gradual accumulation of small certainties arriving suddenly at something obvious. They dated for 14 months, during which they talked constantly about field methods and career trajectories and the strange beauty of intertidal ecology and what they wanted their lives to look like in 10 years. They went to a marine biology conference in Bar Harbor and spent the long drive home talking about nothing in particular in a way that felt significant. The tattoo had been collaborative, both of them in the same studio on a February afternoon, each choosing a different placement. He had taken the inner left forearm. She had taken the right shoulder. She said somewhere she could and couldn't see at the same time. The design was built on a conversation about the mathematics of natural forms, sketched out across 3 or 4 napkins over the drive back from a Chesapeake field trip, refined over hours of arguing about proportions. The Nautilus had to be accurate, he insisted. She agreed, but said the coral should be slightly stylized. They had compromised. It was the most beautiful collaboration of his life at the age of 23. He was aware of that even then. They broke up 6 weeks after graduation. No betrayal, no sudden rupture. Only the slow and terrible logic of 2 people with competing opportunities pointed in different directions. She had been accepted to a postdoctoral fellowship in Washington State. He had taken a position in North Carolina. They had talked about it at length, with the same honesty they brought to everything, and arrived at the same reluctant conclusion. He had driven her to the airport. He remembered the quality of the light that morning, flat, overcast, like held breath. She hugged him at the departure's entrance and said, "I'll call when I land." She did. They talked for an hour and a half about everything except the fact that they were not going to do this. After that, they spoke twice, briefly, over the following year, and then not at all. He had thought about her with the frequency that you think about things that meant something. Sometimes sharply, more often as a low background note. He had built a life. He had met someone else, married, had Owen, divorced. He had moved to Harwick. He had kept the tattoo because it was his and because, if he was honest, removing it had never felt like the right thing to do. Not because he was living in the past, because it was a beautiful piece of work that had meant something real, and erasing it would have been a kind of small lie about who he had been. He was looking at her now across a cafe in Maine. She saw him at the same moment he fully recognized her. The recognition was not a process, it was immediate. The way certain things are immediate when you have known someone well enough that their face is written somewhere deeper than conscious memory. She stopped moving. Her phone dropped slightly in her hand. "Daniel," she said. "Not quite a question. Nora." His voice was steady. He was aware of this as a small achievement. She walked toward his table. He stood, automatic. She stopped 2 feet away, and they looked at each other across 17 years. "You're in Harwick," she said. "6 years," he said. "You?" "8 months." She glanced at her daughters. "We moved in March." "You work at the Institute," he said. He had heard the restoration project had brought in a new lead researcher in the spring, but the name had not registered. "Coastal Plant Ecology," she confirmed. "The eelgrass recovery program." He stared at her. "I'm doing the habitat monitoring side of that program." A silence. In it, the espresso machine hissed. June sipped her hot chocolate. Marin wrote something in her small notebook. "We've been at the same institute for 8 months, Nora said slowly. "And we haven't. Different buildings. I'm in Building C. The plant team is in the new annex." "The new annex," she agreed. She was looking at him with the expression he remembered from 17 years ago, the one she wore when she was updating her model of a situation, taking in new data. "Marin told me about the tattoo," she added. She described it. "I thought it was probably a coincidence. We designed it together," Daniel said. He was not sure why he said it. It seemed like the relevant fact. "I know we did." She looked at her daughters. "Find us a bigger table," she told them. "The one by the back window." The girls moved without argument. Marin was already scanning for chairs. Daniel closed his laptop. They sat for 2 hours. The cafe thinned and filled around them, the morning crowd cycling through. Kala curled up with a book. June fell asleep against her sister's arm. Marin opened her notebook to a fresh page and began drawing with focused intensity. Nora's daughters were 7, she told him. Born in Seattle, she had been there for 12 years, first the postdoc, then a faculty position at the University of Washington. She had come back east for the Harwick program, which addressed a specific restoration challenge she had been working toward for most of her career. She was a single parent, had been for 5 years. Daniel told her about Owen, about the divorce, about the 6 years in Harwick that had accumulated into a life he had not entirely planned but had come to trust. He told her about the kayak he kept in the garage and the shark's teeth on Owen's windowsill. She listened the way she had always listened, fully, with her attention genuinely on him rather than waiting for her turn to speak. "The eelgrass data," she said at one point. "The monitoring transects from the North Shore. That's your work." "That's my work. I've been citing it in my restoration models for 4 months. He looked at her. "Your density projections for the seagrass beds in the estuary section. Those are yours." "Yes. I use those in my habitat assessments." They considered this for a moment. "We've been collaborating," she said, without knowing it. Apparently, there was a particular quality to the silence that followed, not uncomfortable, not weighted, but thoughtful, like the pause before a tide turns. Marin looked up from her notebook. "Is this a long conversation?" "Yes," Nora told her. "Okay." Marin returned to her drawing. Daniel looked at his watch. He had a team meeting at 11 he had entirely forgotten about. He looked at Nora. She had a similar expression, the expression of someone who has just remembered the rest of the day exists. "Wednesday mornings," she said. "I'm here every Wednesday. 8:30, he said. "I come at 8:15. So we've been," she stopped, "missing each other by 15 minutes, he said. "For 8 weeks. She looked at him for a long moment. "That's a very small margin," she said. He sat in his car in the harbor parking lot for several minutes without starting the engine. He was not the kind of person who believed in fate operating in human affairs. He was a scientist. He believed in mechanism and evidence and the patient accumulation of verifiable fact. He did not believe that 17 years of separate lives had been building toward a random Wednesday morning in a Main Harbor cafe. But he looked at his left forearm. The tattoo had been there through his entire adult life, through graduate school in 3 cities, and marrying and divorcing and moving to Harwick and watching Owen learn to read and swim. It had been there the whole time, unchanged, the only design he had ever seen that he recognized as truly his own. And now he had learned that it was not quite his alone, had never been, and that the other person who wore it had been living 8 blocks away for 8 months, working on the same stretch of coastline, and that her daughters had been the ones to close the gap. He started the engine. At 4 o'clock, he picked Owen up from school. Owen had a spelling test back 91%, and a question about why sharks don't have bones, that Daniel answered correctly and in some detail, citing both the evolutionary advantages of cartilaginous skeletons and the metabolic efficiency they provided. Owen listened with the particular attention he gave to things he was genuinely interested in, which was most things. They drove home along the harbor road. "Dad," Owen said, "somewhere around the fish pier. You're being quiet." "I'm often quiet. Different quiet," Owen said. He was 9 and had the observational accuracy of someone who had been paying close attention to his father for his entire life. "I ran into someone I knew a long time ago," Daniel said, "from graduate school." "A friend?" "Yes," Daniel said. "A friend." Owen looked out the window. After a moment, "Are they a good person?" Daniel thought about the question seriously. "Yes," he said. "Very much so. Okay." Owen went back to the window. "Can we have pasta tonight?" "Yes," Daniel said. "We can have pasta." Outside the window, a lobster boat was coming in, riding low and slow. He had watched boats like that hundreds of times. He had never thought of it as a thing arriving, rather than a thing completing. The following Wednesday, he arrived at 8:15 and sat at the window table and found that he was not nervous. Exactly. Alert, the way you are when something in your environment has changed and you have not yet fully mapped the implications. Nora arrived at 8:32 with all 3 girls. She looked relieved to see him in a way she did not try to conceal. They fell into conversation easily, without the friction that social interactions with new acquaintances usually required. They were not new acquaintances. They had been, at one point, the people who understood each other most completely. That infrastructure was old, and some of it had eroded, but enough remained that the reconnection had a quality of returning rather than beginning. They talked about their work first, because that was the natural starting point. Nora had observations about the North Shore transect data she had been wanting to discuss with someone. "You're using a fixed-width transect in the estuary section," she said. "Standard protocol. The substrate there is highly variable. A fixed width is going to underrepresent the patchy areas. Variable width point counts would let the density of patches determine your sample area." He thought about 4 months of data. That would change the recovery trajectory estimates. "Significantly upward," she said. He looked at her. "You've been wanting to say that to someone for a while." She smiled the same quick, precise smile he remembered. "The grad students are excellent, but they don't argue back." "I'll argue back," he said. "I know you will. That's why I came early." The girls were at the adjacent table. Marin was reading. Kala had her rain jacket across her lap, performing some inventory of its pockets. June was eating a croissant with focused attention. Nora watched them for a moment. "They've been asking about you," she said. "What have they asked?" "Marin wants to know what you study. Kala asked if you have children. June asked what your house looks like." "My house looks like a person who had good intentions about decorating and then got busy," Daniel said. "So does mine." He looked at her. "I told my son I ran into an old friend." Something shifted in her expression. "What did he say?" "He asked if you were a good person." She was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "I told him yes," Daniel said. "Very much so." She looked at her coffee cup. A long, quiet moment passed. "We should probably talk about some of the other things," she said. "Not here, necessarily." "No," he agreed. "There are a lot of them." "There are 17 years of them," he said. She met his eyes. "I know. I've been counting." The real talking happened in increments over several weeks. They traded contact information and began exchanging messages during the week, initially professional, about the monitoring program, about the variable width transect method Daniel had tested and found, as Nora had predicted, produced significantly revised estimates. Then, gradually, less professional. Daniel told her about his marriage. Two people who had genuinely liked and respected each other and had built something real, and had ultimately understood that they wanted different things in ways that were not resolvable. Owen had been 4 when they separated. The divorce had been the kind that left both people intact, which did not mean it had been easy. Nora told him about the relationship that had produced the girls. A colleague, someone kind and present until, at some point after the girls were born, he was not. He wasn't a bad person, she said. He just wasn't someone who could handle the volume of a life with 3 small children and a partner with a serious research career. She said it matter-of-factly. The way you describe weather. I used to wonder, Daniel said one Wednesday in November, when the harbor was gray and the cafe warm, whether I made the right call. In 2008, she looked at him. Whether there was a version where I thought about it too, she said. For years. She wrapped both hands around her cup. And then I stopped, because the versions you play out in your head are made up anyway. They don't have the actual texture of what would have happened. I think you're probably right. I'm often right, she said, without inflection. I know, he said. That was always one of the things. She looked at him. One of the things? One of the things I liked about you. The morning noise of the cafe continued around them. Kala had discovered that Owen, who had started joining them on alternate Wednesdays, when Daniel's schedule allowed, knew how to whistle in 2 different ways, and was demanding instruction. June had fallen asleep against Marin's arm. Outside the window, a lobster boat was coming in, riding low and slow in the morning water. He had watched boats like that hundreds of times. He had never once thought of it as a thing arriving rather than a thing completing. Marin noticed everything. This was simply a fact about her, and Nora had learned to take her daughter's observations seriously because they were almost always accurate. Owen's dad is different, Marin said one evening, when Nora was putting the girls to bed. Nora set down the book she had been about to read. Different how? Marin thought carefully. When you talk to him, you listen more carefully. I listen carefully to a lot of people. No, you don't, Marin said, not unkindly. Usually, when people talk, you're also thinking about what you're going to say next. But when you talk to Owen's dad, you're just listening. Nora looked at her daughter. 7 years old, and already she had mapped her mother's conversational habits with field researcher precision. He's an old friend, from when I was in school. You have the same tattoo, Marin said. You didn't get the same tattoo as just a regular friend. Nora did not have a response that felt adequate. Marin waited with the patience of someone accustomed to adults not immediately answering. We designed it together, Nora said. A long time ago, when we were learning about the same things. Marin seemed to accept this. She looked at the ceiling. He smells like the water, she observed. He works on the water. You work on the water too. But you smell like the lab. He smells like the actual water. Nora looked at her daughter. Is that a good thing? Marin considered. It's a true thing. Good might be a different question. She pulled her blanket up. I think it's both. Later, after the girls were asleep, Nora sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and tried to work on the density modeling revisions, and found that she could not concentrate. She kept returning to what Marin had said. You're just listening. She had not wanted, when she came to Harwick, to want anything beyond the work and the girls and the careful, functional life she had constructed. She had been careful about wanting things for 5 years. It felt like the most defensible position, wanting things being the precondition for losing them. The harbor was out there somewhere, beyond the dark window, doing its slow, inexorable work. Water moving in and out, daily, seasonal, on cycles that preceded human presence by geologic orders of magnitude. All of it happening whether you paid attention to it or not. She thought about what it meant to pay attention. The morning in December when things shifted was not, in itself, remarkable. It was a Wednesday. The cafe was warm, Outside, snow had begun to fall on the harbor in the soft, preliminary way of first snow not committing yet, just suggesting the possibility. Kala had assembled a series of questions about the seagrass research over the previous 3 weeks and presented them to Daniel this morning with the gravity of a committee hearing. Daniel answered each one fully and seriously, without condescending. Nora watched and filed this away. Owen had brought a representative selection from his shark tooth collection and was explaining morphological differences between species to June and Marin, using the vocabulary he had absorbed from his father. June was rapt. Marin was drawing the teeth with technical accuracy. At some point in the middle of all this, Nora looked up from her coffee and found Daniel looking at her, not speaking, not leading anywhere. Just the straightforward fact of his attention. She had thought, sometimes, about the strange geometry of it. The 17 years, the same stretch of coastline, the 8 months of 15-minute margins. She was a scientist, and she did not believe in fate as a governing force in human affairs. She believed in mechanism and probability, and the mathematically predictable consequences of particular initial conditions. But she also believed, having spent her career observing ecosystems, in the principle of connectivity. The way things that appear separate are often linked beneath the surface. The way a change in one element propagates outward through relationships you did not know existed until you looked carefully enough. They had been connected for 17 years. Not obviously, not always consciously, but there, in the data, in the tattoo, in the work that had been circling the same stretch of coast before they knew to look. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I've been trying to be careful about all of this," she said, "for reasons that are probably obvious and also not entirely defensible." He was quiet, listening. "I don't think I'm being very successful," she said. A long moment. The snow outside had committed, finally, and was falling steadily on the harbor. The girls and Owen were absorbed in the shark teeth. "I'm not being particularly successful either," Daniel said. She looked at him. He looked back. No performance, no calculation, just 2 people who knew each other well enough to skip the preliminary work. "We should be intentional about this," she said. "Yes, we have 4 children between us and professional collaboration and 17 years of history. We do. I don't know exactly what I'm proposing. I'm only—" "Nora," he said. She stopped. "I've been thinking about this for 6 weeks," he said quietly. "I think we go slowly. I think we introduce the kids to each other's lives carefully, at a pace they can manage." He paused. "I think we've both gotten good at building things that last. I think this is worth building." She was quiet for a moment. "Marin thinks you smell like the actual water," she said. A pause. "Is that relevant?" She said it's both a true thing and a good thing. He looked at her. Something in his expression was soft in a way she had been noticing for weeks, the same quality it had always had. The one she had thought about sometimes over 17 years, the one she had no good word for, except that it felt like being genuinely seen. "Marin's very perceptive," he said. "I know, she's the one who started all of this." The snow was falling on the harbor. The children argued amiably about whether the mako or the great white had more impressive teeth. Nora's coffee was getting cold. Daniel noticed and signaled Patrice for a refill without being asked. Outside, the harbor boats sat quiet in their slips. The water moved, gray and steady, as it always had, not toward anything in particular. Not away, simply doing the work it had always done. The tattoo on Daniel's left forearm caught the cafe light. Seagrass, coral, the precise spiral of the Nautilus. 17 years old. Still, in all the ways that mattered, exactly as it had been drawn. Some things you carry because you haven't let go. Some things you carry because letting go was never the right answer. And you understood this slowly. The way understanding actually arrives only later. Only when you had enough of the data. Nora reached for her coffee. She took a slow breath of warm air that smelled like old wood and the sea. "Okay," she said. It was a small word. It contained, for now, everything that needed to be said. Not a resolution, neither of them was naive enough to mistake a beginning for an ending. There were still the children to consider, the pace they would need, the particular difficulties of two lives that had been running separately for a long time being carefully, incrementally brought into proximity. There were late nights of negotiation and the inevitable friction of different routines and all the things that could not be anticipated until they arrived. But there was also this. A harbor in December, gray water and first snow, 4 children arguing about shark teeth at the next table, and 2 people who had been paying attention to the same stretch of coast for 17 years, finally, in the same room at the same time, looking at each other with the clear eyes of people who have learned, the hard way, what actually matters. The nautilus on his wrist. The same design on her shoulder, invisible under the green canvas jacket. But there. Some things you carry because you haven't let go. Some things you carry because letting go was never the right answer. You just needed enough time and distance to see that clearly. And sometimes what looks like an ending, examined years later with better instruments,